Hi, I'm Sheena, and you're listening to The Right Stuff. Today I'm joined by the fabulous duo of authors who are talking about asexual main characters. Jae, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Sheena.
And Jax Meyer. Jax, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So you guys have both written books with asexual main characters, and we were sort of chatting about it, and we decided it was important to talk about this as a phenomenon within the lesfic circles. And so that's what we're doing today. Let's start off with why you guys decided you needed to write about asexual characters.
I'll let Jay go first because she did it first.
Okay. Well, basically, I knew for a lot of years that I wanted to write about an asexual character because in my circle of friends, I have a very diverse group of friends, and one of them, a close friend, is asexual, and another one is demisexual, and they never find books that represent them or reflect their lived experiences. And I found that so unfair. They grew up thinking they are broken, there's something wrong with them. And when I first started doing research for Perfect Rhythm, there was literally that I could find especially no romance between two women with an asexual character out there. Now there are a few, but it's still not a lot. And I personally think representation is very important. And so I set out to give them a book that reflects their lives.
I think that's super important, especially since we live in what I have heard of referred to as a hypersexualized world. Everything is about sex. So when you're allosexual, you just kind of take it for granted. But I'm imagining that as an asexual person, it's very off-putting for you. Jax, let's talk about you for a second.
Yeah. So this was my third book that I've tackled, and I didn't originally set out to write a book with an asexual character, and specifically I wrote a bit about a demisexual character. And we can define that in a sec, just so I don't lose my train of thought. So I just had the idea in general of a setting, and I'm like, what would be interesting? It would be throwing together a very allosexual character, which is a weird way to say she uses sex to cope. And so sex is her go-to. She's just very sexually focused, but she's not an intimacy focused person, which is the exact opposite of what most asexual people are looking for. They want intimacy, and that doesn't necessarily come in the form of sex, though it can, depending on their situation and their partnership scenario. And for myself, I've used writing as a way to explore parts of my own personality and educate people about underrepresented groups. So with my first two books, that meant an autistic main character, which I am. I'm not a main character, but I'm autistic. And then with this book, I go with the label demisexual, even though I'm not 100% sure it's 100% accurate. But being autistic, I find categories that are not clearly delineated very difficult. So I go with this is the closest label I can find it for now. And part of the reason I am exploring it is because of Perfect Rhythm. Because even though I'd vaguely heard of it, I've been married for 20 years, and it's very hard to determine if you are ever sexually attracted to other people or not, because I'm not looking. The only way I can kind of narrow it down at this point is to say I know that I don't look at a random person and I don't find myself sexually attracted to them. I could be visually attracted, aesthetically attracted, and go, they look good, and I like looking at them. But any thought of any physical interaction is immediately bizarre to me. And if you're in a relationship, that might be the only way to determine if you're at least on the asexual spectrum. So for me, writing Rising from Ash was an exercise in educating myself beyond my own experience, which is incredibly important when writing a book, and also finding ways to explain it and to describe it and to describe the experience of being an asexual person in a relationship, and trying to find that balance between your own intimacy needs and your partner's intimacy needs. Because my wife is also a very allosexual person. I loosely base the characters on some of our interactions because I've run into so many people that are in relationships with people on the asexual spectrum, whether they know it or not. And I think that's the bigger issue in the lesbian and probably the queer community in general, is a lot of us are in relationships that are mixed sexualities as far as ace versus allo, and have no clue and don't know what to do with it. And hopefully between both of our books, they'll have found some ways to recognize it and realize the reality of asexuality instead of the myths.
Let's take like 3 steps back. All right, so for listeners who don't know what asexual means, let's go over that, and let's go over what demisexual means in relation to that, and what allosexual means in relation to that. So I'm going to let you guys explain it, because I am not a fabulous author like the both of you.
So for me, where I try to separate it out is on the attraction side. Asexual just means I'm not going to look at a person that I don't know and that I'm not very close to and say, ooh, I want to have sex with them. My understanding is allo people feel this in varying degrees. But for an allosexual, there isn't necessarily this requirement to have any connection with them at all. One-night stands happen all the time in the books we read and in reality. And people make different choices, but they can at least look at a person and say, ooh, I would like to have sex with them potentially. In the book, I make the joke of, so if Gillian Anderson walked into the room wearing just a bathrobe, what would you do? And for an allo, that could be a total fantasy. And for an ace, they're just like, this is a little weird. Can we have a conversation? And it's just our brains are very different and they're wired differently. For me, I think maybe part of it is linked with the autism. And then there are other autistic people who are totally allosexual. And so this is where I say lines are very blurry and very difficult sometimes. Demisexuals are people that they don't feel a sexual attraction to someone unless there's a connection. And for some, that could take months or years to develop. For others, it could happen potentially over a really intense night. But there has to be that connection. And I think the demisexual label in that part of the spectrum is where a lot of people fit without realizing it. Even my best friend, as I explained it to her, she's like, that sounds like me. I'm like, well, maybe you're demi. Like, it's okay if you don't know or don't care, right? But the labels allow us to create expectations. And without language to create that expectation, you end up with a lot of confusing situations. Allo is pretty much the default in our culture. Allo is the default in our books. And so if that isn't your default as a person, it gets very confusing. And you do end up with that feeling of, maybe there's something wrong with me, or maybe I'm broken. It's especially confusing if you're also trying to figure out your sexuality with regards to what genders you're attracted to. So if a lot of lesbians, maybe they figure out they're lesbians because they tried being intimate with men and it didn't work. Well, what if you're asexual and you're trying to be intimate with anyone and it doesn't work? Then you have to start separating out these forms of attraction and who do you actually want to spend time with and who do you want to spend your life with. So asexuality as a spectrum is separating out all of the things that we lump together in the allosexual world. Sexual attraction, aesthetic attraction, romantic attraction, and that starts to break my own brain. So I understand when other people struggle with where are these lines? What do they mean?
And I think it's also important to remember that it's not about being celibate and not having sex and waiting to have sex like an allosexual people would, like a lot of allosexual people wouldn't be interested in one-night stands either. But that doesn't mean there isn't a certain level of sexual attraction, but they decide not to act on it. But that's very different from a person who is asexual and there's not, that pull isn't there. So there's nothing to resist, So I think that's the important distinction between not acting on it and there is nothing to act on because it's just not there.
Okay. So now here's the thing about lesfic. A lot of readers of lesfic feel like sex is a prominent part of the story because, I don't know, yay lesbians. I can never quite get an exact answer on why it's so important, but a lot of women won't read lesfic unless there's a graphic on-page sex scene, but that becomes problematic when you're dealing with asexual characters, right?
Yes and no. I mean, sometimes it depends on the character. That's the thing. There is no asexual person, like one asexual person. It's a whole spectrum of experiences, and some asexual people, they have sex, they enjoy sex, just for different reasons and in different ways than maybe an allosexual person would. So just because it's a book about an asexual character doesn't necessarily mean there won't be sex and there won't be satisfying sex. It just might be in a different way than readers expected. And even, and that's not to say, I think we need to maybe move away from thinking that sex is what makes a relationship work or what makes it good and satisfying. Like Jax already said, like we need to not lump together all the things that are aligned for some people because they might not be aligned for others. And that means that sexual attraction can be going in the same direction as romantic attraction and sensual attraction, all the other attractions, but doesn't necessarily need to. And it can still be a very satisfying relationship, a very satisfying romance novel, even without sex or without the kind of sex that we usually find in lesbian fiction or in WLW fiction.
And I think sometimes we lean on sexual tension in creating a story rather than the other aspects of a relationship, right? Sexual tension is relatively easy to work on and to write, and people like it. But at the same time, like, the deeper parts are what I'm looking for. And there are a lot of asexual people that we read lesfic. We are perfectly fine with the sex scenes. For me, I find it interesting that it actually helps with my libido, which I wish I'd discovered earlier, honestly, because it would have helped my relationship earlier. However, it is what it is. So there are a lot of ways to play with it, and until you kind of maybe take away that as your fallback to build a relationship in a story, you don't actually even know what the options are. So for me, it was interesting to write a story that was focused on not just them coming together as friends and building that side of their relationship and building that trust, but also finding the ways to meet their own physical needs. Because I don't think it's fair, and I don't have a better word than fair, so if anyone just cringed at the word fair, I'm sorry. It's not meant to be like that, but I don't think it's fair that any one person in a relationship should give up their needs entirely to the other person. And that was what I focused on in Rising from Ash and within my own personal relationship, is how do I meet my partner's needs and honor my own needs as well. If it's a day when I personally don't have any desire for an orgasm, it's detrimental to not say something, because it makes my wife feel awful. It makes it feel like there's something wrong with her. And I didn't have language for this for the majority of our relationship. And now I do. Granted, now our relationship is very different because she has some major chronic illnesses. And so it shifted it, and it's worked out very well for me to be more asexual because I don't feel neglected. And she doesn't feel this pressure to do things that she physically can't a lot of the times. And the only way to kind of get into that side of a relationship is if you decouple intimacy and sex. If you feel they're intricately connected, then how do you adapt when life changes around you? And as we age, that changes a lot. I mean, I'm 40, so I haven't hit menopause yet. My wife is perimenopause, and she's 3 years younger than me because of her health issues. So, and as we get older, all of this changes. Our almost like celibacy creation was literally creating our daughter. So all of us in different parts of our relationship find that we have to manage a difference in whether it's just sex drive and libido or situational, or maybe it's a long distance relationship. And that's where I feel the asexual community is incredibly helpful in expanding the options within a relationship.
Yeah, and also talking about other aspects of relationships where there might be different needs and negotiating that so that each partner feels like they are seen and their needs aren't ignored, and finding compromises that work for both partners.
So here's an interesting point that you're making here. In your book, Perfect Rhythm, right? I read it as like it was this sort of negotiation that they had to find a space where there was some level of sex, but to make both partners happy, right?
Yep.
But that in its own right just seemed really complicated. And do you find that put people off, that sort of need to get really, because I hear and it's not just about the asexual thing, it's about anything where there's like negotiations in sex, BDSM, anything that isn't sort of straight up, okay, let's go to bed together.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any kickback to that?
Yeah, I think that, and that's sometimes a little bit the thing that romance novels do, it all happens spontaneously without a lot of communication. There's no talk about sexual history, about sexual needs, about safe sex, nothing like that. It's just everything works and it's beautiful the first time and it's the best sex ever. And that's not always realistic. And while, of course, in most of my books, because I do write romance novels, the sex is good, I also have scenes like, for example, in Just Physical, one character has MS and she falls asleep in the middle of sex, because that's just what happens sometimes. And for me, it was important that to show that this couple in particular, they have to talk about it. They cannot just make assumptions and jump each other and expect it to be good. They have to talk about what each of one wants and what they're willing to do and not willing to do. And I think that's part of what every reader can take from Perfect Rhythm. I think it could enrich everyone's sex life, to not just expect it to be magically good the first time around and every time after, but to work on it,
There's no like magic first time and best first kiss ever. Oh, my illusions are shattered here. Thank you for being an awesome listener and supporting Tilt, the channel that brings you all the podcasts you want to hear. Thank you for being an awesome listener and supporting Tilt, the channel that brings you all the podcasts you want to hear. Okay, so let's ask why you would want to have unexpected representation if there is some level of kickback and kind of like resistance to anything that isn't the norm.
For me, it really was seeing so many people around me struggling with their relationship. They love their wife or their partner or whoever, but it's stressful on both sides when you don't match on the ace allo spectrum. And sometimes it really can help to read an aspect of your relationship in a book and go, oh, they did that, well, maybe I should try this. And maybe a lot of people aren't cognitively thinking about it the way I do, and that's okay. But I feel like for me personally, it's a lot easier to get ideas from fiction than nonfiction. I could actually see it all play out, and just for me, it means a lot more. So that's one of the reasons. Also, because now there are a few more books with ace characters, and I've read a lot of them now because they're not many and it doesn't take long to read them. But what I struggled with is I liked reading them, but the ones that handled sex on the page that you could actually see how they worked it out were few and far between. And that's what I think most people need, is to know what to do with that. It's what I need, at least when I'm reading. So seeing a couple work out their needs and also, express things like, I wish I could give you what you wanted. And I'm gonna have a sequel that's with the actual characters, Phoenix and Ash. And they're gonna have to really work it out in the real world yet, because they're in an idyllic setting right now. And when they go back and the stresses of the world hit, well, what happens when one character uses sex as stress relief and the other character definitely does not? There's a reason why it's not going to start being written for a while, because I'm still working that out for myself as far as what to write without pissing people off too much. Because some of this stuff is pretty gritty and kind of hard to work through. But if we don't tackle it in a safe fictional setting, how do we tackle it in the real world? So for me, that's pretty big, and I'm one of those people that loves the mind reading magic aspect of fiction. I struggle to express my needs as a person, even after having written multiple characters who are able to do it. It's really difficult for me, and I think there's a lot of readers who find it very difficult. So they love being able to read where people just magically know what the other person wants. And whether it's in sex or just in general, they click so well that they just know. And wow, that would be amazing. Now, granted, I do have that in a lot of situations with my wife, but there's still a lot of times where that's not the real world. And so being able to see different options and examples helps significantly for me as a person.
So, Sandra, you were one of the first in the sector to actually really write an asexual romantic character. Did you get flack from the asexual community because you aren't asexual?
I mean, mostly I've had really good reactions. I just counted. I got one email this morning from an asexual reader, and I saved them all. I've saved all of my feedback emails. And I'm at 34 emails from asexual readers who read Perfect Rhythm and either discovered that they are actually on the asexual spectrum themselves, or they already knew and wanted to thank me for finally someone wrote a book that they can identify with. So mostly it's been really wonderful feedback. Also, I had at least 3 or 4 people come up at various conferences and book fairs and thank me for writing it, either because they are asexual or because their partner is. I've had 1 or 2 reactions from asexual people who felt that Leo, the allosexual character in my book, is actually acephobic because she has this moment when she is thinking about, can I really do this? Can I be in a relationship with an asexual person? It's more about an asexual person in this tiny little town that she wanted to escape from. But I think from the point of view from someone who is an allosexual person with sexual needs and sexual attraction, I think it would be pretty unrealistic not to even have a moment of, wow, how am I going to do this? Is this going to be different? Is this going to be difficult? Do I want to do this? I don't consider it acephobic, and neither did my ace beta readers. I don't know, if you had a lot of really acephobic experiences in your life, you might see it differently. People come to books with their own life experiences, and if you've been hurt in that way in previous relationships and you have been rejected by people because you're asexual, I understand why that hits them the wrong way.
100%. I actually really like that moment in the book because I think when you're dealing with a very big life-changing thing, anything, like I know that when I was first kind of dating my wife. And I say dating in inverted commas because neither of us actually realized we were dating one another. Anyway, during that process, I sort of looked at it and I was like, can I do this? Can I really come out and actually come out as a lesbian? Do I even want to go there? And it wasn't that I'm homophobic or anything. It's just, it's such a life-changing space that you have to at least, ask yourself that. So I think from that perspective, it was realistic.
Yeah, and also you have to consider what her life was like. She was a pop star. Everything in her life was hypersexualized. It was all about her looks, how she looked, how she acted, how she attracted people, and I mean, partly that's what makes him work really well, because for her, Holly's asexuality is actually a positive thing, because for the first time she's appreciated for things other than her looks and her sex appeal. So it's not that she thought it's something negative. But also I found it positive that immediately she didn't think that Holly would have to be the one to compromise and to give her what she needs. She was thinking about she needs to give Holly what Holly needs, which is no sex, or she assumed it would be no sex. So I think that's, for me, something positive and not something to criticize her for, that she had this moment of wondering, how is this going to influence my life and my relationship?
And I just have to say that is just the quintessential lesfic thing for me. It's so beautiful that in woman-loving woman relationships, it will be this: what do I need to do to make the other person happy? Not how can the other person make me happy. And that is, lesfic is so wonderful. Anyway, okay, Jax, I have a kind of a reverse question for you. So you are on the ace spectrum, and how are allosexuals feeling about reading your romances? Are they going, well, you actually can't represent us? What's going on there?
I don't think anyone really knew for the first two books, and definitely no one complained. I write sex very much from the philosophy of what does it add to the story. I write reasonably graphic sex because that's what I read, and I'm still kind of finding my own feet. Like, what is my, not even comfort level, just what's my writing style going to be as far as sex scenes? Because I don't have a comfort level especially if I'm reading or listening alone. Obviously, I think everyone's comfort level changes if they're listening with someone, but for me, it doesn't bother me in the least. I just find that the type of sex scenes that work best for me are the ones where they're really getting into the characters and getting into their feelings and moving the story forward, not just sex for the sake of sex. At that point, I end up usually giggling or laughing, because it's just like, did you need to write that? Whatever, it's fine. Like, you just kind of go past it, and I think a lot of Ace readers do that, and even a lot of Allo readers do that. For a lot, they want the story to move forward through the sex scene. They don't want gratuitous sex. After a while, it just gets to be, what's the point? I had Allo and Ace beta readers on different parts of the spectrum, and the response has been very enthusiastic on both sides, and that I really appreciate, because I wasn't worried about the Allos. I made sure that each physically intimate scene kind of would work for both, or did my best to. It was a little tricky to write that, and I sent out reader copies to well over a dozen people that volunteered who identify as ace in some way. I did tell them there is sex in the book. I got different types of feedback. Some loved it. Some specifically mentioned that as an ace reader, they found the sex scenes were good. I had one person say that they have an asexual book club and that they told them that there was sex in it, and a bunch said they wouldn't even read it. So sometimes that stuff's a little frustrating, to have it judged purely off of that without knowing how it's being written, right, and what's going into it. But at the same time, we all come in with our expectations and what we like. So a book is never going to be right for every single reader, and that's okay. So my little artist heart gets a little sad at that, but it's fine. Like, I would rather them not read something they don't want to read. But right now, across the board, response has been very well received. And I feel like there's probably more pushback from the Allo community because they don't know what to expect. And they don't know if they can relate, and they don't know if they want to read a book. Even though I say there's sex in it, they still don't know what that's going to look like and what that's going to be like. And it's fascinating because there are a lot of writers that write fade to black and minimal sex, and I probably have more sex in this book than some other books do, but no one questions it, they just assume it, and then they find they love the story anyway, so they don't care that there wasn't sex in it. So it's interesting.
This is a beautiful segue into exactly why I asked you guys these questions. I did a brief Facebook discussion in the Lesbian Review chat group, where I asked the question, why don't you buy books with main characters who are asexual? And the two predominant outcomes were, apart from the people that do and love it and whatever, is that A, they don't actually understand what they're going to be reading, and B, if they are on the ace spectrum, they want to make sure that whoever's writing the book represents them fairly. And I think so why people are not buying ace books right now or writing them is because there's not a lot of understanding about it. And I think that's just the only issue, really.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but then this is a chicken and egg scenario, right? You got to write the books in order to get the readers. But you're not going to sell those books because the readers are not going to buy them.
Yeah. It's part of why I waited so long. I knew for 5 years. I mean, part of it was I really wanted to make sure I understand the spectrum of what asexuality can be. And the other part is I wanted to make sure I have a big enough name that people are going to read the book anyway, even if they might have their doubts about, will I be able to relate to an asexual character? They will buy it because they trust me at this point of my career and will buy the book.
I think you managed to do exactly that. You cracked open the sector. And then as a result, people like Jax can come along and say, okay, well, I can write asexual characters because it's not completely unknown.
Mm-hmm. I just did a survey, when I created my Facebook group, I asked questions to screen people a little. And one of them is, what is your favorite Jae novel? And I just counted and I realized actually Perfect Rhythm is my second most popular book. And that's pretty amazing. And the majority of my readers are not asexual, so they could relate to the characters and they love the book. It's more that the people who would need to read the book to realize they can relate to characters who are not allosexual. There's still a few who might shy away from it, which is okay. I mean, there are people who, but it's a little mind-boggling. You know, there are people who read novels about shapeshifters and they don't question whether they might be able to relate or not, but they doubt that maybe they might not be able to relate to an asexual person, which is a little astonishing.
Absolutely. Let's talk about positive feedback and like what is the thing that you've written about in terms of asexuality that has made your heart the happiest in terms of like responses from readers?
For me, I think it differs based off of whether they're allo or ace. So from the allos, I love when they can see kind of what I was getting at, which is intimacy and sex are not intertwined, and they can be, but it's not the only way. And so to see that the romance is still there, the draw between the characters is still there. It's just the reason for the draw might be a little different based off the characters and their sexuality. And then on the ace side, I love it when they say, I could see myself, and that they could enjoy it, and basically just, it's one more in a short stack of books that they could point to and say, at least part of me is represented on these pages. It's really not much different than any other book, you know, but knowing that I didn't completely screw up the representation, you know, so far the only real negative comment I had, and it was constructive criticism, was that I didn't address the aromanticism side, and even through our discussion, we haven't addressed that. Asexual gets a lot more attention than aromantic, and I genuinely can't even begin to figure out what to do with a romance novel with an aromantic character, and yet I'm trying to work it out in the back of my head for one of the spin-off characters. I don't know yet how to do it.
Okay, so for listeners, let's just split off what's the difference between what is an aromantic person versus an asexual person.
I'm handing that off to Jay.
I actually do have a Holly's best friend in Perfect Rhythm is aromantic. It's basically, there's not just a spectrum of being either asexual and the entire spectrum to allosexual with gray sexual and demisexual somewhere in the middle. There's also a spectrum of, are you romantic, not in the sense of candlelight dinners and so on, but in your, who are you attracted to romantically? Or are you not attracted to any person, male, female, non-binary, trans, whatever, at all? So that's the spectrum too. You can be demi-romantic, you can be alloromantic, you can be aromantic, and fall anywhere on that spectrum. And that doesn't mean that these people don't feel other types of attractions or don't want close bonds to people, but they don't feel a romantic attraction. Same as asexual people don't feel a sexual attraction.
Okay.
I know it's a little.
No, we're gonna have to do better than this because I'm so confused now. Okay. Wait, I'm Googling this.
Well, and I have a friend that I met on Twitter. I don't even know how we met anymore. Accidentally, I guess. She lives in Malaysia. And since they don't have an Amazon ebook store there, I sent her copies of my books, and we've just been chatting. And for her, she gets confused by the labels too, but she very much is an asexual, aromantic type person. She doesn't have any need to spend her life with a person. Dogs, yes, but not a person. And people make her feel very kind of claustrophobic and tied down. She loves her friends, but just doesn't feel that need to partner up and do that. I can understand that aspect. Where I struggle is where it gets into more of the gray area of all of that.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful not to confuse two different things. A friend of mine is asexual and aromantic, and she lives in a partnership. Not a romantic partnership because she's aromantic, not a sexual partnership because she's asexual. It's a queer platonic relationship, just as Mac and Cho have in my book. And they're supporting characters, so I didn't spend that much time on it, but they live together, they share finances, they have a house together, they have a dog together. There's a high level of commitment, and anyone else just assumes, yeah, of course they are a couple, meaning a romantic couple, but they are not, because it might look like it from the outside, but the feelings are different. They're not romantic in nature.
So, on a very sort of practical level, would they sleep in two separate bedrooms?
They have separate bedrooms, but there are queer platonic couples who cuddle, who might kiss, not in a sexual way, but more like maybe to greet each other. It varies from person to person. There's a whole spectrum, and it boggles. Most people are like, what? I don't understand. This is even harder to grasp for most people than the asexuality spectrum, because they just see look at the term just friends, like that already implies that, okay, this is not, the quality isn't as good as a romantic relationship. And in our thinking, it's like we are so binary, like male, female, romantic, platonic, and there's nothing in between. And as a psychologist, I think pretty much anything and everything is a spectrum. Romantic feelings are a spectrum too, and romantic attraction and sexual attraction. And I think it's good that more books are starting to explore those aspects so people can realize how diverse it is, and that it's okay if you don't follow the traditional path.
Absolutely. Okay. Jax touched on the fact that a lot of us learn through fiction earlier. So because of that, there's even more onus on you guys to do the research to make sure that the characters are well represented, because you are the forerunners in the lesfic community in terms of putting the rep out there now. Is there anything else you guys want to add to this? Like, what are we missing?
Well, earlier I wrote down also part of what's changing in lesfic, and this is a challenge that I think has been made by quite a few people. I think Tara stands out with it. That and in the Me Too era and stuff is adding consent. And I think when you're writing an asexual character, you have a perfect opportunity to show consent in a way that's not awkward or uncomfortable, but a necessary part of navigating the relationship. And so it's there are going to be some readers that balk at it. They probably balk at it in their real life and are thinking, I don't even know where to begin with consent and what that looks like and what that should be. But hopefully, both as more and more writers write consent into their kind of traditional romances, and then as you read more like asexual characters, seeing how consent is handled and just checking in. I'm not a person that reads a lot of BDSM at all, but that's also one of the benefits I feel of the BDSM community and reading BDSM is that consent has to be there. And if it isn't, that's a pretty iffy situation and could get dangerous very quickly. So I think that's where the fiction can inform us and give us tools. Especially as an autistic person, I need to see examples in order to know where to go with things. So seeing all of these different examples really opens things up. And I think it gives people a new freedom and a new way to approach their relationships, whether they've been married forever or they're just meeting someone new. We can all learn and make our relationships better because of it.
For sure. Jay, are you going to write another asexual character?
I might. I have so many ideas and so little time to write them all. I've actually been asked by some people to write about the relationship that we were just talking about, Meg and Joe, the aromantic character. But as Jax said, she's aromantic, and I think some people misunderstand what that means. She's not gonna fall in love, and not in that kind of romantic love. I've had one review for Perfect Rhythm 2 that said like, and that was the only review that bothered me. Someone said she was a little disappointed that Holly didn't overcome it in the end. And being asexual is not something to overcome, just like being a lesbian or being bisexual or any other sexual orientation isn't something to overcome. And it saddened me a little that after reading the entire book, or hopefully the entire book, there was still a reader who didn't grasp that it's a sexual orientation and it's just as valid as any other sexual orientation. But I hope that as there are more and more books with more diverse characters who are anywhere on the spectrum, that it will normalize it, and people will continue to grasp what it is, because there are a few books that handle it that way, where there's one lesbian romance where the main character, one of them is asexual, and after having sex with the other main character, she's suddenly magically cured, and that's so damaging. It's very problematic, and so I hope as there are more and more diverse books published, and even straight romance readers are more and more open to reading diverse books, that they will all be more open to recognizing diversity and living diversity, and as Jack said, trying to learn from it and seeing how can we handle things like consent in our lives and in our own books.
And I think that's for people who maybe want to consider adding more diverse characters to remember that. Like, you need to talk to a lot of different people in that representation, not just one. Because writing own voices, I'm still just one person and with one take on things. But that can really screw me up if that's the only person that I'm talking to as myself. If you want to dive into the asexual world, you need to do a lot of research even when you're in it. And so never forget that having a better understanding of the whole spectrum allows you to handle it better. And so having one reviewer point out that, yeah, Ash is still demi at the end of the book and she's demi at the beginning. This isn't a coming out story for her. It's just the first time she's able to fully advocate for herself within a relationship. And that's really rather important.
All right, where can people find you online if they want to connect with you guys? Jae, let's start with you.
The best starting point is always my website, where you can also find all my social media, jae-fiction.com.
Okay. And Jax?
I'm most active actually on Twitter, where my tag is ButchJax, and has been a tag for like 25-30 years. I am on Facebook a lot as well, and I don't even know my website name off the top of my head because I haven't bought a unique username. But I do link to it in the back of all my books, and but it's easiest to find me as ButchJax on Twitter.
I'll add links in the show notes for anybody who's interested. All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
This has been The Right Stuff. I'm Sheena. You can find more information on thelesbiantalkshow.com or find links to our guests in the show notes. If you enjoy what we do, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thelesbiantalkshow.